Hi, I'm James Governor, co-founder of RedMonk, and we're here for another RedMonk Conversation. Conversations about technology, what all's going on, and today we're going to be talking about the future of serverless databases, and in particular, an idea that Fauna DB has put forward, which is the document-relational database. And I'm sure many of you are immediately scratching your heads, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about document-relational, what that means, why it's so relevant for serverless technology and the kinds of applications that developers are going to be building now and into the future. So today with me, I have Tyson Troutman, VP of Engineering at Fauna, and Matt Fields, Chief Architect and co-founder. So thanks for joining me, folks.
Absolutely, our pleasure. Big fan of the show, excited to be here.
Yep.
Good. Okay, awesome. Yeah, great to see you. I think for me, any good story about where development is heading is probably around developer experience. One of the big things is an industry trend that we're really looking at is how to make developers more productive, how to have them, frankly, doing less of the tasks they don't want to do, and more just building cool applications. So in terms of developer experience, why don't you say a bit about the journey that you're on at Fauna, thinking about serverless and developer experience and how to improve it. So. I don't know, Matt. Tell me about developer experience and what you're up to there.
Right. Yeah. So, I guess I could start a little bit by talking about like what exactly our goals with Fauna. I think it provides that context because
Yep.
developer experience obviously means like a lot. There's a whole development life cycle that and we're just like one part of the piece of the puzzle that developer is working with to build their application. So like from our perspective, we're really trying to be like essentially the ideal like database backend, for your connected application. And so I think, kind of what that means is that, through the development process, like how does Fauna, the service, support that iterative development experience to make that easier. Like we want Fauna to be like, flexible and essentially intuitive use in terms of that interface, right? So the document relational model is part of that, but there's also like, how does Fauna fit within your stack, your existing libraries. And not only that, I think there's, beyond just that initial kind of iterative development process, which, I think as an application evolves, you're always getting back to. But then there's also like, how does the application evolve over time? A big, a long-standing issue like traditional database systems, for example, is like you often have to go into this like upfront design process, and then once your schema is kind of baked, you're prevented from effectively changing that.
Right.
And so a big part of Fauna is also like thinking of schema as a organizational tool for how you think about data, or like the database as an organizational tool, but also like it has to be able to adapt over time as those application needs change. So that's another big part of it too. Like how does the system essentially like scale with your application as it grows, not just in terms of like data set size, but in terms of feature complexity and things like that.
Yeah, I think some of this came out of, frankly, we don't talk about it so much these days, but like NoSQL, certainly the views about, schema, how we can be more flexible in the apps we're building. So Tyson,
Right.
like in terms of where you are in thinking about this model, this different way of, certainly for me, I think some of the triggers when you were saying, hey James, what about document relational? I was like, okay, so we've had NoSQL, we've had the relational renaissance. So in terms of like where the journey you've been on and like what you think, why do you think now, in terms of meeting the needs of developers and developer experience, why is document relational something that you want to get behind?
Yeah, part of that is sort of rooted in the history of relational databases and document databases, right? So if you think about this, the arc of databases, relational databases have been around since the 1970s. You can think about these categories in terms of both kind of the primary benefit that the name describes, but also additional benefits that have been ascribed to these categories just based on the history of evolution. So for a relational database, the primary benefit, your data is stored as a series of relations with predefined columns, attributes or columns, in what we think about as a table, and the ability to link data between tables, which is very powerful, do things like joins. And then there's these secondary properties. Relational databases were typically ACID compliant. typically expose SQL as a data query language, data manipulation language, et cetera. It's a bunch of problems that kind of started arising with that model in the early 2000s. I'm sure most of the listeners of your show are very familiar with. I know you're familiar with. We could go into more detail there, but document databases were born to address a lot of those problems. They store data as documents. They're also scalable typically, but they give up things like ACID compliance as part of that. And they typically don't let you do things like more complex joins over different documents. And so really, where Fauna is at, our number one mission is to make you as productive as possible without thinking about your database. We want to let you do what you want to do with no management, no additional overhead, with high consistency. And so Fauna stores data as documents, but we provide the ability to reference other documents, to issue complex queries, to do joins over documents, and return that data in the shape that you want it in your application, along with being consistent, supporting cross-region replication, all of that other goodness, I think, that we can provide.
So part of the story you're telling is that it's basically, there are always trade-offs in any database system that we use. On the other hand, there is, you're putting forward a view that perhaps thinking about trade-offs, that doesn't mean you need to sacrifice some of the productivity that we had from the document model, then with some of the operational capability that we had on the relational side.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's fair. I wouldn't think as much in terms of trade-offs as Fauna leverages. Fauna was built inspired by a research paper that came out of Yale called Calvin. Cool paper. We don't want to build technology for the sake of technology, but what emerges is this database with this very interesting set of properties that fit very nicely to these modern application development use cases.
Okay. Tell me a bit about the operational model, Matt, because I think one of the things that just in terms of where we are as an industry, and we wouldn't be talking about serverless technology when it's not the case. Clearly, cloud managed is the direction of travel for pretty much all infrastructure. It's been super important in terms of data and making things easier for developers. I think, frankly, one of the reasons that we've seen a bit of a resurgence around relational is that now it's managed in the cloud. So it's not something that I have to worry about. Now, this has been, I guess, from Fauna's perspective, something for a long time. So in terms of the operational model, like, what are some of the learnings that you've driven into product that help with scale? Again, you mentioned, replication and so on. Like, where are you with that? What do you think some of the key strengths from an operational perspective are from Fauna in building, high scale apps?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think like one thing that was kind of interesting back in the NoSQL era, we talked about trade-offs, right? I really do think that there kind of arose this like false notion. Part of it was just kind of, I think, the state of the art at the time was you end up having to make this trade-off of things like strong consistency, like ACID transactions in order to scale. In the earlier days of Fauna, when we were kind of first pushing this notion of, hey, like you can scale, you can have consistency, you can have global availability in this database, in a database, like there was a lot of skepticism that, this wasn't actually possible. But if you look at like systems like, if you look like, say, for example, like the Dynabook paper or like systems like Cassandra, it really was this, I would say the kind of like the value proposition there was essentially like if we let you throw away all of these guarantees in order to be able to get scale. So a big part of Fauna is really just like taking all that away and giving, I think, for developers the ideal operational profile, which is you don't have to think about it at all. The only aspects of, essentially the only aspects of Fauna's operational profile that we bleed through are things like where do you want your data, which is important for things like, regional, like data sovereignty compliance and things like that.
Yeah, tell me a bit about that, because I think that's an interesting question that, when we came distributed databases, and certainly cloud-based databases, where these are decisions that we don't have to make, that sounds great. And, certainly like Google, I think we had that when they were originally, trying to sell things like Gmail to governments in Europe. And they'd be like, "Oh no, this is awesome because you don't need to worry about it." And meanwhile, the Home Office is kind of going, "It's kind of our job to worry about it." Like we kind of, yeah. So
Go ahead. Sorry, James.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, our goal is not to eliminate all decisions from the developer. We want you to be able to make the decisions that are important to your business, your application. Right. Certainly where your data resides is one of those decisions. And so Fauna supports this concept of region groups where you can define, we can define in our public region groups the footprint that those sit in. So today we have 3 region groups. EU, there's an EU region group, there's a US region group, and then the one that kind of spans those footprints. More public region groups will come in the future, but we also support the notion of private region groups where customers can come in and tell us, this is the footprint I want, potentially even across cloud providers, and we can support that, essentially an arbitrary region group definition.
Okay, so the reason I sort of think that's important is that, we're currently, well, I guess the buzzword or the buzz phrase at the moment is like platform engineering. But really thinking about, to your point, like these should not all be developer concerns. We've got people that need to curate and manage a platform for them so that they can be productive. And I think being able to apply policy across so that the developer doesn't need to think about it and they're compliant, that's I think where the industry is coalescing right now. I think that's going to be increasingly important over time. I mean, look at the geopolitics is, the world is not flat. Let's just, if we know anything in 2022, it is that. So I think that's just, compliance, residency, super important, and exposing at least some of that so that an operator is in a position to make those decisions.
Absolutely.
That's important. So what do, we're going to sort of say, we mentioned, I've used the word serverless a few times. What sorts of apps and what sorts of developers are using Fauna, at the moment? And I guess, what are your ambitions there? So like, what's your kind of, your classic, persona developer that's using the platform, and what kinds of apps are they building?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. I mean, I'd say it's varied. What we see, first of all, in terms of company stage, we've seen adoption from everywhere from sort of early stage companies that are all in on serverless, very forward thinking, and are building, their architecture on Fauna from day one, onto larger enterprises, that are building specific applications on Fauna. It's in terms of sectors, it's everything from e-commerce to, certainly manufacturing, healthcare, telecom, gaming. We have some really companies in the gaming sector doing some really cool things. And it's the gamut from greenfield apps to some applications that are being migrated from all of the other commercially available databases. Had a cool story there recently. We had a game technology company that stores metadata about video game performance in Fauna to be analyzed by serious gamers and pro teams. They're scaling like crazy. And they actually migrated to us from CockroachDB and saw a 70% latency reduction across regions for their customer base. And I think that's, those are the kind of stories we love to hear because it's, again, the architecture is completely in service of that end customer benefit. And I think part of that is, Cockroach obviously has invested very deeply in performance and multi-region, but there's a lot of knobs that you have to figure out how to turn. And this was, I think what this customer saw was they were able to just jump onto Fauna and see that low latency out of the box, which is great.
Ouch. Next time you tell that story, you're going to have to say who the customer is. I mean, I feel like I should push you on that now because it's like, you're definitely, nice kick in the chops there for Cockroach.
Sure.
So we'll have to take that on trust, I guess. But that's the sort of area. That's the quotes.
The quotes on our website. The customer's a customer called Insights GG.
There you go. So, but those are the sorts of wins you need to have. That's. I don't need to ask you who your competition is because you've just identified some of it. But of course, as you say, the traditional relational vendors. So enterprise. This isn't just for startups, is it? Like the transition is now into enterprise. Are they ready? Do they understand how to build apps in this way? Like what are you seeing? Any interesting stories there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think, we often think of enterprise as, essentially kind of like being like those technology laggards, but I think what we found is they really run the gamut as well. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that's been really interesting seeing, I think some of these, companies with these larger, with these larger set of applications that they're having to support is that the flexibility of Fauna, really the flexibility of the serverless model in general, means that they have options for how they integrate. Like this is, again, this is not just Fauna. I think it's the fact that serverless as a technology that's easy to consume. So we have customers who are using Fauna, essentially in that traditional 3-tiered app model, where they have their own compute layer and they're consuming Fauna, and that compute may be instances in AWS, or it may be maybe it's like serverless lambdas, all the way through to direct client integration, where they're taking advantage of Fauna's access model and permissions control properties to integrate Fauna into the application, in the browser on the mobile app. And so, I think so that ends up being, that ends up being, I think, really interesting to see in terms of like how it really becomes like a choose your own adventure in terms of how you can leverage the system.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd also, if I can just piggyback there, James, one thing that we see from large enterprises, a lot of those enterprises have digital transformation initiatives. They have sort of their own internal incubators that are out there looking for like, how can we be faster? How can we be more agile? And a lot of times that's the sort of the first point of contact. A good example of that, so Lexmark has their internal Lexmark Labs,
right,
where they're building this Optra line of IoT devices, and they've built that are pushed into like point of sale locations, and they're storing all the data behind those devices in Fauna. It's been a really cool collaboration. But that's an example of where you see the kind of early adopters even within the large enterprise, and then as those units see success, the hope is that continues to drive adoption deeper into the enterprise based on achieving those business objectives, because that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we've seen. Look, the need for velocity, more application flexibility. There are very few industry sectors where they're not concerned about that, right?
Yep.
Like everybody needs to be building apps in order to. I mean, look, you wake up, you're a bank, you wake up one day, and Apple is like, oh yeah, now we're doing payments, and and then you're a startup, that does this like pay at the end of the month or whatever. This company Klarna here in Europe. Again, Apple one day they're like, oh, by the way, interest-free, pay in 2 weeks. So financial services company competing with Apple. Healthcare, Apple's going to be in that market. And obviously the startups. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about retail, or you mentioned telco, or even manufacturing. Manufacturing, great example. Automotive in Germany, like Tesla lit a fire under their butts. I mean, there's just there's no way that they can they just are very aware they need to get better at software. So yeah, I mean, now that's not to say that it's usually pockets. You mentioned Lexmark Labs. We see quite a lot of that. So it's but yeah, I don't think we're seeing many in industry sectors where there aren't opportunities for like modern databases, modern applications, and so on. That said, so I do have a question about, so thinking about developer experience, thinking about like, what I forgot to tell my family that I was recording this, so I'm just going to power on through, but there's like a whole bunch of shouting going on, and I don't know whether I'm going to delete this or leave it in.
Matt and I both have kids, so we know how that goes.
So if we think about developer experience, like what environments are people using? So we've seen, Matt, I think you mentioned like the 3-tier world. We've seen a lot of sort of 2-tier, fat orchestrated clients actually, built in things like React. The front end is now doing a lot of the orchestration. What sorts of environments are you optimizing for And if I'm as a developer, like, yeah, like what's going to make me be like, oh my God, like FaunaDB did a really good job of thinking about the kinds of apps I'm building. Like what does that look like from a developer experience perspective, languages, frameworks, and so on?
Right. I mean, obviously, like JavaScript is a big environment. So and that's like essentially like every the architecture you talk about, essentially it's all front end. It's all kind of like drawing from the front end and those technologies. I would say it's we're seeing a lot of actually one of our customers has an interesting architecture where they're actually using and we're seeing this across more where they're using Fauna from the edge. So they're using something like Cloudflare workers to kind of augment that compute, but they're also again kind of getting into this they're able to again, like I said, like pull Fauna directly in within their browser or within their client, like so that React Native app or that React browser application, and integrating with Fauna directly. And so I think that's a big part. That's a part where like I think the capabilities that we provide in terms of being able to like send in terms of being able to like push some of that business logic to the database directly really does let you kind of eliminate that essentially that middleware tier that has traditionally sat between as that broker between your front end and your database.
Yeah, I think it's a very different way of. I think it's quite a different way of thinking about building apps. And on that note, then let's talk a little about. You mentioned Cloudflare. They've just got a huge amount of momentum at the moment. I mean, their product momentum is pretty substantial. On the sort of the partner side, then this is a question for Tyson, I guess. Like, so yeah. Who, from developer experience, very often needs good partnerships because you want good, tight integrations, with different cloud players and so on. So, who are some of your partners that are notable in terms of delivering a good developer experience? And again, in the serverless space, I was going to ask Tyson, but Matt was like, "Oh, wait, yeah, go ahead, Tyson."
Sure, no worries. There's a number of them. We try to start with the customer use case and work backwards from there. So if you think about where customers want to access their data, it's everywhere from these kind of modern front end hosting environments like Vercel, Netlify, to sort of all of the different flavors of compute providers. You mentioned Cloudflare, obviously the traditional big web service providers as well, AWS, GCP, a number of others that I'm omitting here. But if you think about the requirements, the more that you move away from this traditional 3-tier architecture where you're accessing your database in region and starting to push compute out towards the edge, towards these end client devices, number one, performance is everything, because you can't afford to go across the country, across the pond, whatever, to go and get data, where you're suddenly talking about 100 milliseconds versus sub 10 milliseconds. And Fauna lets you do very fast reads, consistent reads from the local region without pushing that consistency logic to your application. It also is very unconstrained in terms of data access patterns. So unlike something like Dynamo, where you're primarily using, it's KV access, or you have to build indexes, where the business logic's running the client, you might have to do multiple round trips to your, from the US West Coast to Virginia or something like that. With Fauna, you can push sort of arbitrarily complex logic as part of a transaction that we can run over your data and return a response. So very powerful in terms of performance implications.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. The default US East 1 has been interesting, and I think that we're as an industry probably going to see a bit of a change in that regard. Just as you say, for performance and frankly flexibility reasons, with architectures, I guess, such as yours. Okay, open source. Like RedMonk, we're always talking about the value of open source. In terms of seeing technology adoption, obviously, there's comfort factors there about knowing that it's not single source and so like, what's FaunaDB's take on like open source and standards in this world.
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah, I can. I mean, I could talk. I think one part of this, and I think Tyson, probably has more to add to this, but part of it for us is also focus, right? I think, if you look at a lot of, I think, across the competition where, those providers are providing, an open core model. I mean, there ends up being compromise in terms of the developer experience, in terms of what they can offer. Like for us, we can provide a very, a very powerful, clean core developer experience, and a lot of our ability to actually eliminate a lot of this operational overhead is by essentially kind of building that service behind it. And so, whereas if we have to think about that open source product and providing a lot of those operational capabilities to the developer, a lot of the things that we can abstract away in terms of operational concerns, those end up bleeding through in any sort of open source offering, we have to provide for the service itself.
Yeah, and I'd say, I mean, to be clear, we're huge fans of open source. I think like everything, it starts with the customer requirements, then we work back from there. And I'd say, what I've seen in my career is for products that customers are going to take and host or manage, open source is huge because you need the ability to fork that repo. If there's something odd about your environment or your scenario, you need that level of control. And that's why all of the client side pieces of Fauna that you might use to interact with the database from your infrastructure are open source. So all of our drivers, our shell, et cetera, are all open source. When you get to managed services, it's a little bit different because typically the mindset is manage is a big reason why you selected that service. I don't want management. Yeah.
As I say, RedMonk is, open source is an important part of the world, obviously, but on the other hand, people choose managed services for a reason. There's a reason why people actually, I don't want to manage this myself. I mean, we end up with classic example we've seen a lot of organizations doing monitoring. We're it's going to be free. We're going to build it ourselves with Elastic Stack. And then they're like, wait, we have 30 or 40 people supporting this application. I'm pretty sure this was not, the model that we'd originally planned for. So that, look, not everything needs to be open source. And managed services, developers choose them. So, I think that's a perfectly reasonable answer. Okay, so we've spoken about the serverless. We've spoken about sort of the two-tier model. We've spoken a bit about what specifically you mean by document-relational. Oh, here's a question: do you think that other people might end up also using that term, and would that be a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's I think that it's interesting because I do believe it's a and what we're trying to provide is essentially that principled mix between those two paradigms, right? Something that makes sense together. We don't want to just take relational capabilities and document capabilities and bolt them together in a way that says, hey, we can provide both. It really is, what we're really trying to do is kind of rethink how do those things blend together, in a sort of principled fashion. So other vendors, I think, kind of adopting that, I think is only a good thing because it means the idea has merit. I mean, we're certainly not coming at it from, inventing it from whole cloth too, right? If you look at the way, I think Fauna structures, data responses, which is a big part of that. A lot of, you see a lot of the same things in, for example, GraphQL, from the pure API perspective. So the reality is, as an ecosystem, it makes a lot of sense. And I think it validates, the idea, when there's more players in the space.
I feel how did we get so far into the conversation without talking about GraphQL? You've just mentioned it. I should ask you about GraphQL. What's your GraphQL story? So we have a GraphQL API that lets you access, the exact same data, but through GraphQL. It's pretty simple in terms of that. And you have, the idea is for us to provide, the ideal, essentially the ideal GraphQL API for your data, in terms of how you defined it. And so, and you also have control over
like the user functions that you can define, you can expose those via GraphQL as mutations and things like that. So, and we certainly see like, like I want to say like, at least around half of our users are accessing Fauna like essentially exclusively over GraphQL from their clients.
That is an extremely interesting stat. Okay. That's good. I'm glad I asked the question because that's super interesting. Okay. We talked about the model. We even got to GraphQL. I don't know, Matt. So like I guess what's you having, as a co-founder, you've been on this journey, like, is there what's the single, what's your one, like, what's the thing you're like, in building a company, like, what's if you had like one lesson you'd learned, like,
yeah, that's a good question.
What would that be?
Well, I mean, if I were to put it trillly, I would say that solving the technology problem is the easy part. But really kind of like getting into it, I believe that like, I mean, really like, as a business, like we're not building a technology just handing off, like we're building a product, and that requires more than just like, it requires like, an amazing engineering team, and I believe we have one of the best, but it requires, but I guess that I think is the word, like it requires a team behind it. And so I think that's really what it comes down to. It's not just technology; it's everything around it that supports it, that lets users and our customers, really adopt it and bring it into their own environments and make use of it.
To me, I always just think it's about sheer stubbornness and bloody-mindedness.
that goes without saying.
I mean, yeah, company founders, you gotta be stubborn as shit, basically. That's my top tip. Anyway, it's been a great conversation. Thank you both for joining me today. It'll be interesting to see that, a little bit of conversation around this document relational idea. But thanks for coming. Thanks everyone. Let us know if you have any watching the show, if you have any comments, thoughts, questions. I'd love to hear them. I'll pass them on to FaunaDB. But thank you both, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.
It's our pleasure. Thanks for having us.